Hello, everyone. New World Economics here, and this is the January 9th Global Geopolitics Update. So, a little bit different today. I want to talk about some things going on in North and South America, along with what's going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, we're going to start off talking a little bit about the what's going on in Mexico with the cartels, and then we're going to talk about Brazil, where it appears they've had a bit of a January 6th moment on January the 8th. So, but you guys know what I mean. And then we're going to go through the daily frontline update for Ukraine. So I'm going to try with this one. I'll try to put like 3 timestamps in the video below. That way you guys, if you want to hear about Brazil or if you want to hear about Mexico, Mexico is going to be first. Or if you just want to skip straight to Ukraine, you can do that. But I'm not going to do, detailed, itemized timestamps throughout the video. They just take way too long. All right, so for some of you guys that don't know, there was a top cartel boss that was arrested in Mexico over the last week, and he was the son of El Chapo, one Ovidio Guzman, which he was arrested by the Mexican government and flown into Mexico City. And there's about a 50-50 chance that his arrest and delivery to Mexico City is not a coincidence with Joe Biden's visit to Mexico City. Some have speculated that it might be some kind of like gift to like bridge the gap that exists between Obrador and Biden. The president of Mexico and Joe Biden don't really get along too well. It's not. But obviously he has far worse relationships with other world leaders, but they're completely different personality types. Obrador, if I'm sorry if I'm getting his name wrong, was more of a Trump-like figure, except for he's on the Mexican left, right? So, a little bit of background on this. Since the arrest of El Chapo Sr., a couple years ago, Mexico really, it honestly did a lot to destabilize the cartel situation in Mexico. Basically, the Sinaloa cartel went into a bit of a civil war. And among El Chapo's sons, there's like a rivalry for control of the Sinaloa cartel. In the meantime, there has been some other breakaway cartels. And the most dangerous is by far the Jalisco New Generation cartel. So this is this is a good map here to see. The orange here is where their control is, and this is a direct spinoff of the Sinaloa. It's not run by any of the direct family members. It's ran by a guy named, I believe, like El Mincho or something like that, who's just really, really brutal. The difference between Sinaloa and J&G is really like Sinaloa cartel actually has a pretty good standing with the locals in the regions that they control. It's almost like Sinaloa is the government in those areas. They provide some kind, security for the people living in the towns. They keep the crime, like local crime, down. They don't brutalize the people, the population. They tend to reinvest some money into these cities and towns within their area, and that's to win the population over. So not saying that like people are pro cartel, but like they're either neutral or leaning towards pro cartel in those areas. So like indifferent or positive opinions, whereas the J&G is rules through an iron fist. They're very violent, very brutal, and it's basically a huge cartel war to see who has control of the country at this point. And up to now, Sinaloa has been losing ground. So I think this was very well described by Peter Zion in his latest video, like the reasoning behind the Mexican government nabbing Ovidio Guzman, because and this is my interpretation of it. You might think that going after a Sinaloa man might make the situation worse, because you could take power away from Sinaloa and leave kind of a vacuum for J&G to fill. But what was going on in Sinaloa was infighting within Sinaloa, which was causing a lot of violence in the regions that the Sinaloa controls. And potentially, and this is just my interpretation of the situation, by removing one of the main antagonists in the situation, it could balance out the Sinaloa cartel, and allow them to reverse basically the decline of the Sinaloa cartel, which is probably, obviously Mexico would be better without any of the cartels here, but it's just like a lesser of two evils situation. Like, if the Sinaloa is the one that's, actually, more favorable to the people, and put some investments back into Mexico, if they're trying to work their way into more of like a legitimate business model, versus just like a brutal warlord type situation, which is what you get with J&G. It's obviously, J&G is the bigger threat to the country. So we'll see if it works out that way. And honestly, I'm not an absolute expert on any of this stuff. I just, kind of have a pretty good understanding of geopolitics and how that works. And I have a little bit better than a base level I've engaged in better than base level reading on the topics, so I might know more than some of you about this, but I'm sure there's going to be people in the comments that know much more. But that's a real gloss over the situation. So potentially, this guy, Ovidio Guzman, could be presented to Biden as kind of like, say, hey, like, look, we're doing something about violence in the northern regions of Mexico, which, is very important to U.S. interests. Obviously, well, this actually isn't so obvious, but cartel war is not necessarily drug war, because like when people think drug war, you think like Reagan, like the war on drugs, which is basically a war on the consumer, right? Which is what people have a big problem with, going after people that are using drugs rather than, the main distributors right down the road, right? Well, the real drug war, and the one that definitely should be fought, should be against these like gangs and these cartels that are in Mexico, and their kind of control over things. And obviously nabbing one of the cartel bosses is a big step in that. The U.S. has very, very big interests in combating these cartels. They present one of the only real geopolitical threats to the United States. Obviously, Russia is a threat in its own ways. China is a threat in its own ways. But the cartels in Mexico actually border the United States. So instability in Mexico can much more easily spill over to the United States. Whereas, like, obviously, instability in the Middle East or in Ukraine and all these other places, the U.S. doesn't really see a lot of those direct side effects. So this is definitely on the radar of whatever Democrat or Republican is in office, to take care of, the cartel problem. So, if there's any other big news on the situation, I'll keep you guys updated. Of course, there's been some demands sent by Sinaloa to the Mexican government to release Ovidio, or there's going to be problems, but I don't see it's very likely that happens. He was actually captured once before, back in 2019, and they immediately turned him loose because they didn't manage to even get him out of the town that he was captured in. The cartels basically sectioned off the town and entered a big standoff with the military, and the military actually immediately turned him back over to the Sinaloa cartel. And obviously it was looked as huge defeat for the Mexican federal government and the military, because they couldn't face off the cartel in a battle. Like, they were just under-equipped for that job, which also says a lot about the Mexican cartels too. They have some pretty heavy firepower and equipment. Actually, a lot of these groups actually have their own like special forces and stuff. It's kind of amazing. Now, so moving on to Brazil. So Brazil had its own little January 6th event, and this is the capital of Brazil, Brasilia, and it's a very interesting event. It happened on the 8th, and it was basically a capital riot, which can basically you can explain it as like the governor of the state of Brasilia. It was pro Bolsonaro. Actually rewind a little bit just so you guys are aware of the situation. There's a recent election in Brazil. Lula da Silva versus Bolsonaro, who was the incumbent. Bolsonaro is kind of a far right populist, and then Lula da Silva is like a far left populist. But I mean, you can't really characterize right and left in the same way that you could in American and European politics. It's very different. I mean, in my opinion, these guys, it's tough to tell which is worse. I mean, I'm sure like some people from Brazil would disagree. Obviously there's two sides in Brazil that would disagree with me on that completely. Like, Lula's worse or Bolsonaro's worse. But I mean, Brazil is just kind of like a tough country to run in general. It's never really going to be very wealthy. And I mean, this is kind of like a bigger macroeconomic picture that I've talked about earlier on in this channel. But for a state like Brazil to ever achieve some kind of modern wealthy status, they would need extremely heavy infrastructure investments. So basically a huge bill at the beginning in order to be like semi-wealthy in the end. So like, there's geographically an escarpment that surrounds Brazil, a chain of mountains that separates all these coastal cities from the interior. So if you want to develop resources in Brazil, which is really their only opportunity of wealth, Brazil has the Amazon, which they can log out the trees. You can see there's a lot of that going on. They can sell timber as a raw resource, and then after that, they develop the land that they clear for agricultural purposes, and then that could be exported as a resource. And that's what they've been doing, but they don't make a lot of profit off of these things because of the high level of cost and difficulty of moving these resources from the Amazon over the cliffs and stuff to get to the ports to send that worldwide, right? So like, we talked a couple times about America. Anywhere in America, you could basically drive less than 100 miles to reach a major river where you can load all of whatever you've got onto a barge and just float it downstream to the ocean. It's basically free to float stuff downstream. Whereas if you keep that stuff on trucks, you're paying $7 a gallon of diesel for however far you're going. Those prices add up, and by the time you get that lumber or whatever to the ocean, it has a lot higher cost than what it started with, right? So like, this is one of the main reasons why Brazil is poor, is because it has no easy way to export the resources from the interior. And in a world where that money, like that high amount of capital that we've had over the past 20 years or so, in a world where that's drying up and there's less and less capital available, a place like Brazil becomes more and more of a bad investment, or more of a risky investment. And, macroeconomically, it's not good for Brazil. And that's probably one of the main causes to these riots and protests that seem to have sprang up rather organically. In my opinion, they probably would have happened regardless of who was elected. Similar to where, there's a decent argument that there would have been bad protests in D.C. regardless of whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump got elected too. But, Biden got elected, Trump supporters came out and protested, and that's history. So in Brazil, Lula got elected, Bolsonaro supporters have come out and protested. Any way you turn it, like, these are people that are probably upset with the economic situation, and they're blaming it on politics. The local governor of Brasilia was a Bolsonaro supporter. He let them in. They managed to storm the Capitol complexes. I'm not necessarily sure if the Brazilian Capitol building itself was stormed, but I know the Parliament or the Brazilian Congress, along with the presidential palace and the Supreme Court, were three buildings that were definitely stormed by protesters. The situation is ended by now. It's over. The Brazilian military took control of the situation, forced everyone out. It's a big test for Lula's rule, it shows that he does in fact have at least positive relationship with the military. There was kind of a fear that the military was very close with Bolsonaro, and if this happened, they wouldn't step in and do anything about it because they actually supported some kind of coup, which didn't turn out. That wasn't the accumulation of the situation. The military actually stepped in on behalf of Lula, put down the protests. There's reportedly, initially they said 400 people arrested, but now it's looking like it's in the thousands that are being arrested now. And Lula's rule over Brazil is a lot more secure after that situation. So Lula has positioned himself as a pro-BRICS, like more, not necessarily like pro-Russia. He is a proponent of friendly relations with Russia, more so than Bolsonaro was. And Bolsonaro represented closer ties to the U.S. Now, that was kind of strained because Bolsonaro and Biden don't really get along very well. He was like more of like Trump's man that he wanted in Brazil. But that might be a bit of a dramatic stretch. I mean, I don't really think that he was placed there by the Americans when he was elected. I think more or less, though, he just represented a side that was more friendly to the U.S. than Lula is. So that being said, there is no evidence so far of any kind of foreign meddling to create the situation. That's what I mean by organic, is this organically developed through the sentiments in Brazilian society, right? Okay. So, and if there's any update on that situation or any information that it might have stemmed from something else, I will let you guys know. And I have some video, photos, basically, of what happened. This is, the resident of, this is the presidential palace here, and then you have, protesters in parliament. Very similar footage to what was going on January 6th in the U.S. in 2021. So, very defining moment for Brazil, and you have the military coming in and cleaning the situation up ultimately in the end. All right, so moving on to northern Ukraine. So let's see what we are in terms of time. This is definitely going to be a longer video than typical, but that's okay. Interesting information coming out of northern Ukraine. Russia reports, so take that with a grain of salt, but I have no reason to think these reports are complete bullshit. That reserves from Chernigov are being transferred to Bakhmut Soledar. So if you remember, recently we talked about how the Russians were also reporting it looked like around 4 battalions of troops have been transferred to the Chernigov Belarus border, basically this northern border with Belarus and Russia. This isn't that grouping that's being redeployed. It appears that like one of the many training camps in between Chernigov and Sumy and Kyiv regions here, where different brigades, either fresh brigades are trained up for combat, or old brigades that have taken a lot of attritional losses are deployed to in order to re-equip, reinforce with new fresh recruits and train them up. But one of the brigades from the training grounds is the one that they're talking about, apparently, that's being sent and transferred to Bakhmut. So more evidence that the situation in Bakhmut hasn't been developing good for the Ukrainian side, mainly on the fact that they're using up precious reserves in order to hold Bakhmut Soledar, which there's a lot of people that are criticizing that on behalf of the Ukrainians. It certainly is an issue, but I definitely do see the importance for Ukraine to hold Bakhmut Soledar, really at all costs, because it could develop into a very poor situation for Ukraine. They could end up losing quite a bit of ground in this region of the country if their front lines fail here. It's obviously not going to turn into a massive breakthrough, But basically, so you guys can see it on the map, this area here can be considered as like the Donbass industrial zone, and this is the area where it's like very tough to fight in. It expands, basically the outer rim of it is Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and should the Russian side succeed in pushing the Ukrainians out of this area here, this is the biggest obstacle in the entire east out of the way. It really gives the Russians some room to mushroom out in all directions from here. So the best place to hold the lines for Ukraine has always been here throughout the entire war, and losing a major transport hub, giving the Russians access to the outer rim of this industrial zone, is not good. So Ukraine definitely needs to hold on there, and it appears like should the Russians be accurate and the Ukrainians are transferring reserves to the area, well, it's good for the Ukrainians. They definitely need the help on the line there. So at the same time, Ukraine is continuing preparations for a potential invasion in the north. It seems like they're working out logistics, supplies, increasing border activities. There is a report, not exactly sure if it's true or not, but it would go along with this, that they're reducing what they said vacation, but basically furlough time for border guards and troops on the north. Basically, they were with not a lot of activity in this area. Sometimes they would go on like 5-day long vacations, and they would expect to be reporting back. Not exactly sure how many times throughout the year they could do that, but apparently that's no longer an option, which could suggest that Ukraine is expecting some kind of activity in this area. But once again, take that with a grain of salt. We really, I'm not on the ground. I don't know for sure what is going on there. So in the Svatova front, the Ukrainian side claims they've repelled attacks near Stelmakivka, Kolomichkaya. So zooming in here, on Ukrainian mapping, they say that they control Stelmakivka, and Kolomichkaya is in the gray zone. The Russians claim that they control this town. The fighting is reportedly in between these two towns somewhere, potentially to the north here. So they're claiming that they've repelled Russian attacks in that area. And then likewise, a similar report from the Russians. In the latest Russian mapping, it appears like they are at least claiming that they hold on to Dubrova. They've managed to hold out after several Ukrainian attacks in the area. And we're going to talk about Dubrova again in a minute, relating to Soledar further in the south. Okay, so moving on to Soledar, some huge developments in the area and some interesting stuff that we're seeing here on this map, which is the Institute for Study of War map. And as I've told you guys several times, the yellow is the Russian claim that can't be confirmed by Western sources. This is just what they're just reporting on what the Russians say they've driven up to at that point. And then the red is the areas that they can confirm that Russian sources have entered. So these are the areas that they admit to. If you guys would have seen, I had a post the other day where I broke down an exact, I guess you would say, geolocation of Russian sources in the rail yard and factory at the salt mine here, and it appears that the ISW has confirmed that. And then I will point to you guys a point far in the north of town, if you'll zoom in here and see that they are confirming Russian control over one of the high rises in the northern parts of Soledar. So looking at our map, this high rise that they're singling out is this one. I had seen similar information that the Russians had captured this high rise here, but either way, I think it's a direct confirmation that the Russians are both pushing from the east, south, and north on Soledar. So you have Russian activity in 3 different axes of attack on Soledar here. So not very good for Ukraine. It doesn't bode well for Ukraine. On top of that, Russian sources are claiming that they've managed to capture Podgorodny, and the fighting has actually entered Krasnogora. And there's some evidence that there's been sporadic fighting near Blagotny as well. So, worst case scenario here, should that be true, you have Russian, capture of Podgorodny. You have Russian forces moving forward and capturing Krasnogora, which the main claim here is that there was a swing around, or specifically, I guess I should reduce this. The Russian side managed to capture the heights in this area right here. So they managed to bubble out, capture this height. This is like where the high ground is. If you look here, I believe it's on this map, or... Yeah, it was on this map. See, 201 meters, 140 meters, 92 meters. This is the high ground in the entire area here. So after the Russians managed to capture that high ground, they then swung down from the north and captured Podgorodny from that direction, right? So looking at it from this map, looking at Podgorodny, you can see Russians came actually from two different directions. They've been coming from this direction, but Wagner personnel kind of swooped around behind the town, and they were able to capture it basically from two different directions. And then from there, it's a pretty easy jump into these forested areas and into the outskirts of Krasnogora. Now, I think at the point it's limited on how deep into Krasnogora the Russian side has made it, but honestly, it might not be very long before Russia makes pretty significant gains in this area. Like we were talking about with the elevation, once you crest over this hill, you have this entire road and all of these towns within sight. This is the low ground right here. So this is actually the main transportation artery that connects Bakhmut with Seversk. And Seversk is very involved, very important central logistics point, as you can see all the roads leading in and out of the town, for this entire front here facing off against Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, as well as the Ukrainian attacks towards Kreminna and Dubrova. So should Soledar fall, which right now you're looking at a situation where the Russian side has, had pretty good gains to the south, pretty good gains to the north, and pretty big gains here directly into the east recently. So you have an operational environment where it's surrounded on three sides. Not a good situation. So should it fall and the Russian side manage to capture a foothold on the road, or at least put enough pressure on the road to prevent any movement of traffic, which it appears might already be the case, then Seversk, will no longer have protected flanks and will no longer be viable probably for offensive activities. I'm not going to mistake the claim that this will cause complete collapse of the line to the north of Seversk. It very well could, but I've been wrong in the past, so I'm not going to make that claim. There's still potential. There's several roads moving through, here and here, which the Ukrainian side can continue to supply their troops with in this area. But it will make the situation difficult here. It will make it to where any supplies coming in and out of Seversk will probably have to be dedicated to protecting the lines in these areas, if anything, which makes Ukrainian offensive activities towards Kreminna very difficult. Right now, the main attacks towards Kreminna are coming from two different directions for the Ukrainians. They're pushing from Torske down the road here, and probably the more promising direction is across the river near Serebianka and into the forested areas where they have a lot more cover from Russian troops. So they're advancing in these two directions. Should Seversk be put under threat, the advance in this direction would no longer be possible. Should it fall, it definitely won't be possible. And then Kreminna would be secure for the Russian side. So the development of this situation in Bakhmut basically potentially is a domino effect where, if you have I mean, really, honestly, it starts with this gas station here. Then the fall of Bakhmutsk, the center of that, Yakovlivka, now the entire southern part of Soledar, and then potentially the rest of Soledar, Krasnogora, which would basically be the nail in the coffin for the logistical situation for the Ukrainians to the north here. So, very bad situation developing there. And I will have this map updated for tomorrow's report. All right, so Bakhmut. So interesting bit of information here, and I don't think this is intentional, but Russian sources have indirectly confirmed the success of Ukrainian counterattack in this area. So there is some good news for Ukraine. They recently said, and actually a Rybar report, that Wagner troops were advancing on the waste sorting plant, which is right here. And then there was fighting in the area of the plaster factory, which we believe is right here. So these are two locations that were previously reported as captured for the Russian side. If you'll look at the ISW map, this is an area that the Ukrainians had claimed there was a counterattack in that was successful. It appears that this is correct. And that the Ukrainians did manage some local success and counterattack. Obviously for the Wagner troops to be advancing on the waste recycling plant, it means the Ukrainians had to recapture it, right? So, local counterattacks, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut still have the power to retake and recapture some ground in the area. So, the fight for Bakhmut is not yet over. Ukraine's still transferring their resources into the area. The main problem, the main question is Soledar. Can Ukraine get forces to reinforce here in time to reverse this situation? It's looking like maybe not. There was the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, which was transferred into the area to reinforce the 128th and the 61st. Make sure I'm getting it right. 63rd. So it's the 63rd and the 128th Mountain Assault that were holding the line at Soledar. Both probably desperately need to be rotated, but the situation's so bad that Ukraine probably can't get away with the rotation. They've dropped in this Air Mobile Brigade. There's also a couple tank brigades helping out in the area. The first or the 17th Tank Brigade, a battalion of that, and the 4th Tank Brigade. The word is that I've heard is this 17th Tank Brigade. One of them, I'm actually now that I'm looking at it, I'm not sure. I've heard that one of them has taken pretty heavy equipment losses because they were actually moved in first to cover this flank of 63rd. When it seemed like Russia was making gains to these fields, they were deployed there to help the situation. This is just what I've read, and supposedly they've taken pretty heavy losses as well. So really what needs to happen for Ukraine is they need to stabilize, then they need to rotate out at least these two units right here, 63rd and 128th, with fresh units, and that might help to reverse the situation. But currently it seems like things are so bad right now that trying to swap troops out on the front line might not be an option. We'll see. All right, and the last update I have, where actually, there is reports of fighting to the south, but nothing really conclusive where we know about the gains. There was a explosion in the port of Очаков. So this area here, you'll see it's a dotted line as an assessed Russian advance rather than assessed Russian control. So basically, ISW saying that they're not absolutely sure that Russia has full control over this area, which is probably true. There's not good infrastructure out here. Ukraine seems to be constantly trying to sneak over deep reconnaissance groups in this area. So, at any given point, there's probably a couple special forces teams for Ukraine operating here, not necessarily more Ukrainian troops than Russian troops, and not exactly sure they can supply that. But Ochakov would be the port where a lot of this stuff is coming from. So the Russians have, and the last couple of weeks, hit Ochakov pretty hard with some missile strikes. And today, I actually have video for you guys. It appears like a pretty good strike it hit. You can see the port's already burning at this point. It seems like this is pretty close to an ammunition cache or something. But I'll go ahead and play this for you guys without sound. Now that would cause a lot of damage to the port infrastructure of Ochakov. Huge area on that explosion there. Zooming in real quick, I'll give you guys a look of this and another look at the video. There's two separate port structures here. There is actually this port right here, which is probably the civilian port, and then there's this port right here, which I believe is the military port. And I actually might have those backwards. I actually do have this backwards. My apologies. This is the military port, and this is the civilian port right here. So pulling up that video, looking at where this might have, I see 1, 2 piers. How does this work here? I don't know. It's really hard to tell. To me, it looks like this port right here, so the military port where this video might have been taken from somewhere on the beach here, you can kind of see a bit of a gap right here, which is a much larger gap here, but it could, this could be a matter of perspective where it looks like a smaller gap. But should this be the accurate location, the explosion probably would have been somewhere on this pier right here. We'll go ahead and give another watch. Maybe someone in the comments can determine exactly where that happened. The only other thing I can think of is potentially, this have been somewhere in this area right here, in this little, port structure. Maybe, but it's hard to tell. Anyways, this is probably in order to assist an area that was being used in order to assist Ukrainian efforts to cause problems for the Russian on the Kinburn Spit, which is this peninsula here. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.